I am Laura Hayes, a successful psychologist helping people deal with their inner demons. My life was measured and calm, working in a cozy office in downtown San Francisco, evening walks with my husband, Mark, and endless conversations about life, books, and philosophy. Mark is a corporate lawyer, a man with an impeccable reputation and a mind of steel. We've been together for many years, and I thought I knew him like the back of my hand. But one evening he caught me off guard. "Laura," Mark began, a slight tension in his voice, "I need to talk to you about something." I grew cautious. Rarely did Mark speak in this tone, gentle, almost pleading. He wasn't the kind of person to ask for something without a good reason. "Do you remember my friend Toby Miller?" he continued, and I nodded. Of course I remembered. A childhood friend Mark mentioned from time to time. Well, Toby had serious problems in London, personal and professional. He recently returned and doesn't know where to stay for now. I thought, maybe we could offer him to stay with us for a while? Mark's words caught me off guard. I felt a mix of emotions inside. On one hand, a desire to help, on the other, a sense of anxiety. No matter how hard I tried to understand myself, I couldn't figure out why this suggestion made me uneasy. I looked into his eyes and saw genuine concern for his friend. Not wanting to disappoint him, I smiled and nodded. "Of course, Mark, let him stay." When Toby arrived, he was not what I imagined from Mark's stories. Tall, with short-cropped chestnut hair, he looked like a man who had weathered many storms. There was a shadow in his eyes, something that made my heart beat faster. He entered the house with minimal belongings and a mysterious expression on his face, and I couldn't help but feel a strange attraction. His presence was intriguingly alarming and, at the same time, dangerous. The moment I met his gaze for the first time, I realized something new and entirely unexpected was beginning in my life. Toby had been living with us for a few days now, but he remained an enigma. I watched him move around the house carefully, as if he were a temporary guest in someone else's life. He didn't speak about his problems in London, never mentioned what troubled him. But every time I looked at him, he seemed like a man hiding a deep inner pain. I began to notice myself seeking opportunities to talk to him alone. At first, I convinced myself that it was just professional interest. As a psychologist, I had always been drawn to complex personalities, people with unresolved issues that required analysis and understanding. But the more I observed Toby, the clearer it became that it was something more. His voice was soft but deep, with a slight British accent that made every word he spoke just a bit more mysterious. When he spoke, I found myself listening intently, trying to catch hidden meanings. He talked about his life in general terms, avoiding specifics, but his eyes said it all. Sometimes he smiled, and in those smiles I saw a strange mix of sadness and relief. We often crossed paths in shared spaces, the kitchen, the living room. Sometimes I would start a conversation, hoping he would open up to me, even a little. He answered cautiously, carefully choosing his words, but at the same time, our conversations became more trusting. He spoke about his travels, his love for music and books, but he never touched upon what happened to him in London. I felt that behind this silence, something significant was hiding, something that caused him pain. One evening, when Mark was late at work, I found Toby in the living room. He was sitting with a book in his hands, but he didn't seem to be reading. His eyes were staring into the void. I sat down opposite him and couldn't resist. "Toby, don't you want to talk about what happened in London?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something that made me freeze. For a few long seconds he was silent, and then, with a barely noticeable smile, he replied, "No, Laura, I think I shouldn't talk about it just yet." His answer only fueled my curiosity. I realized I was trying to rationalize my interest in him as professional, but in reality, something deeper was awakening inside me. His mystery attracted me like a magnet. I knew I had to be careful, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. That evening, Mark called to say he would be late at work due to an urgent matter. The house was quiet. I was sitting in the living room, lost in my thoughts, when I heard Toby walk into the kitchen. His presence had become inexplicably compelling to me, and unexpectedly I got up and followed him. Toby turned, smiling when I approached. Mark is going to be late, I said, feeling my heart beat a little faster. Maybe we could make dinner together. He nodded, his smile friendly, but there seemed to be something more in his eyes. We began pulling out ingredients, and our hands occasionally brushed against each other as we moved around the kitchen. I felt warmth spread through my body and tried to focus on chopping vegetables, but my hand trembled slightly. You know, Toby began softly, as if he didn't want to break the peace of the room. I've never had to think about my mistakes as much as I have lately. I paused for a moment, looking up at him. His words sounded unexpectedly candid, and I felt this was a chance to learn more about him. What mistakes? I asked cautiously, not wanting to scare him away. He smirked, his face tensing slightly. Many, Laura? He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Like never appreciating what I had until I lost it. I always thought I'd have time to fix everything, but sometimes time just runs out. His words made me think about my own mistakes, regrets, the things I might have missed in life. We began to talk about it. Our mistakes, the decisions that brought us to where we are now. The conversation became unexpectedly personal and intimate. At one point, our hands brushed against each other again, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked at him, and for a moment our gazes met. I felt my heart race, and I realized that something was changing between us. I saw in his eyes not just mystery, but vulnerability. He wasn't just a mysterious stranger. There was something fragile about him that made me want to be closer, to understand him, to protect him. This realization thrilled me, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. It was at that moment I realized that something had developed between us that shouldn't have, but I couldn't bring myself to step away. Over time, Toby and I began to spend more time together. Our conversations grew longer and deeper, discussing literature, music, and philosophies of life. I couldn't help but notice how he felt and thought, how his thoughts were filled with something special, something that drew me to him. Toby seemed like a fascinating and mysterious interlocutor, and each conversation revealed a new, even more intriguing side of him. Mark also began to notice that something unusual was happening between us. I could see how he looked at us when we laughed at something or when our conversations stretched late into the night. He said nothing, but I felt a certain wariness in his gaze, as if he wasn't sure this was all just friendship. One evening, Mark mentioned he needed to leave for a meeting. I stayed home with Toby. We were sitting in the living room when Toby suddenly suggested watching a movie. I agreed, trying to hide my delight at this chance to be alone with him. We chose an old drama that was captivating in its depth. The film played, and the room was enveloped in twilight, illuminated only by the dim light of the screen. At some point, our legs accidentally touched. I froze, expecting Toby to pull away, but he didn't. I felt a current run through my body and my heart started to beat faster. We both remained still, our legs still touching. It was more than just a touch. It felt like a quiet call, some invisible attraction that was growing stronger. I felt the tension in the air between us, making me feel alive and exhilarated. As the film ended and the credits began to roll slowly across the screen, Toby turned to me. There was something in his eyes that made me hold my breath. "Thank you, Laura," he said softly. "Thank you for letting me stay here. I wouldn't have managed without it." His words were simple, but there was something more in his voice, a deep gratitude mixed with something else I couldn't quite define. I met his gaze, and for a moment time seemed to stop. I realized there was something more between us than just friendly affection. Something that had been brewing for a long time and was now becoming more evident. I felt it in every touch, every glance, every quiet moment when we were alone. And although I knew this was a dangerous game, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I had never felt such an acute inner struggle before. My feelings for Toby began to frighten me. With every minute spent near him, the attraction grew stronger, but so did the guilt. I was married, I loved Mark, yet I couldn't get Toby out of my head. His gaze, his touch, those quiet moments when we were alone, they all haunted me. I tried to focus on work, held consultations, and conducted sessions with my patients, but thoughts of Toby kept coming back like persistent shadows. Even when I tried to distract myself with family responsibilities, planning dinners with Mark or doing household chores, his image kept popping up in my mind. I started avoiding him, avoiding places where we might cross paths, not going to the kitchen when I knew he was there, avoiding being alone in the living room. But I soon realized that this only increased the tension between us. When our eyes accidentally met in the hallway, or when we exchanged brief words, I could feel something invisible vibrating in the air, something that was pulling us closer together. Toby seemed to feel it too. His behavior became more insistent. He suggested spending more time together, taking a walk in the park, going to an exhibition, watching another movie. I found excuses, declined, trying to keep my distance. But every time I said no, I saw something like a challenge in his eyes, as if he wasn't going to give up. One evening, when Mark was late at work again, Toby approached me, his gaze firm and determined. "Laura, I know you've been avoiding me," he said plainly, his voice calm but with a hint of stubbornness. "But we both know it won't work. Why not spend some time with me? Just talk. You know running away from this is pointless, don't you?" I felt an inner conflict ignite within me. I wanted to refuse, but at the same time, something in his words made me pause. My logic screamed that this was a dangerous game. But my heart was on the edge, pounding wildly, urging me to listen to my true desires. I knew I had to make a choice, but making it was unbearably difficult. Every moment with Toby felt too real, too alluring, and I wasn't sure if I could resist it anymore. It was an evening filled with doubts. When Toby suggested we go to a bar on the outskirts of the city, I felt a tight knot inside. This was clearly not something I should do. But his voice sounded so convincing, so easygoing, and I suddenly realized that I was tired of constant self-control, tired of trying to fight what had become unbearably strong. "Let's just go out, Laura," Toby said with a smile that made his offer even more tempting. "It's a place with live music. Let's just relax, get away from all this." I hesitated, but something inside me pushed me to agree. After all, wouldn't it be better to just give in, if only for a while? Maybe it would help me finally release this tension. I agreed, and we went. The bar was on the outskirts of the city, a little lost among old buildings and neon signs. Inside, it was cozy and warm, smelling of beer and fried snacks, with a jazz band playing in the corner, creating an atmosphere of a special kind of magic. Toby ordered us cocktails, and we sat at a table against the wall. At first, I felt tense, but gradually, under the influence of his presence and the lightness of the music, I began to relax. We talked, laughed, our conversations became more playful, more intimate. I couldn't help but notice how his eyes sparkled, how he leaned closer when he spoke to me. "You're beautiful when you laugh," he said suddenly, and I felt my cheeks flush. "You're dangerous, Toby," I replied, smiling, but my words were serious. "Dangerous?" He raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. "Why do you think so?" "Because you make me feel things I shouldn't," I whispered, barely audible. He didn't respond right away, but I saw his eyes darken, and the smile disappeared from his lips. At that moment, I realized we were on the brink of something important. We went outside to get some fresh air. The night air was cool, and I felt goosebumps rise on my skin. Toby suddenly stopped and turned to me. There was something irresistible in his eyes, something that made me hold my breath. He took a step closer, and before I knew what was happening, his hands wrapped around my waist and pulled me close. Our lips met, and the world around us disappeared. I felt everything inside me ignite with a bright flame, my thoughts scattered, giving way to pure sensation. I responded to his kiss without hesitation, without fear, savoring every moment. It was as if I had finally let go of myself, allowed myself to feel everything I had been hiding inside for so long. His lips were soft and insistent, his touch demanding yet gentle. My heart was pounding in my chest. I felt his hands on my back, his warmth, his breath mingling with mine. I forgot everything. About Mark, about our life, about the guilt that had been eating me from the inside. I lived in that moment, giving myself to it completely. When the kiss finally broke, I looked into his eyes and saw not only desire but something more. After our lips parted, the world around us came crashing back with a deafening noise. I felt my heart pounding wildly in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, a mix of guilt, shame, and excitement. I couldn't stay near Toby for another second. Without a word, I turned and ran, ignoring his call. I sprinted down the dark street, feeling tears start to stream down my cheeks. Inside me, conflicting emotions raged. I knew I had gone too far, allowing myself to feel what I shouldn't have. I tried to justify my behavior, but it all felt wrong. Wrong to the very core of my being. I loved Mark, and that was a fact beyond question. And yet, why couldn't I stop thinking about Toby? I knew it couldn't go on like this. I had to make a decision, stop this destructive whirlwind that threatened to consume me. When I got home, I made up my mind. I needed to cut off contact with Toby, save my marriage, keep my life as it was before. The next day, I started avoiding Toby. I tried not to cross paths with him, avoided him in the hallways and common rooms. I limited our interactions to the bare minimum, trying to remain polite but distant. I told myself it was for Mark, for our marriage, for everything we had built together. But Toby didn't give up. I could feel his gaze whenever I walked by. His presence was palpable even when he was silent. This made my inner conflict even more unbearable. I tried to focus on Mark. I tried to put all my energy into our conversations, our evenings together, our dinners. But he sensed something was wrong. Mark wasn't a fool, and soon his patience ran out. One evening, as I sat at the table with a book, he came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "Laura, I feel like something is happening," he said softly, but there was concern in his voice. "You've been distant, like there's a wall between us." I wanted to tell him everything was fine, that it was just stress from work. But he continued, "Let's spend an evening together, just you and me, like we used to. I'll organize dinner and we'll talk, okay?" I agreed, feeling in his proposal a desperate desire to bring us back to what we once were. Deep down, I knew I had to try. I had to save what was left of our marriage. The romantic dinner that Mark had so carefully organized was supposed to be our chance to start over. He had created an atmosphere of warmth and comfort, lit candles, soft music, his favorite dishes that he had cooked himself. I could see how hard he was trying, looking in my eyes for something familiar, something that would bring us back to what we once had. But it was unbearably hard for me to be near him, knowing I was hiding the truth. My guilt weighed heavily on me, pressing down harder and harder. I looked at Mark, saw his anxiety and concern, and realized I couldn't go on living like this. I couldn't pretend everything was fine, couldn't hide behind fake smiles and empty words anymore. We ate almost in silence, and I could feel the tension between us growing with each passing minute. Finally, Mark set his fork down and looked into my eyes. "Laura, tell me what's going on. I can see you're not here. Something has changed, and I want to know what." His words were quiet, but there was a deep pain and worry in them. I took a deep breath, lowered my eyes, and felt tears welling up. "Mark, I need to tell you something," I began, trying to gather my thoughts. "I can't keep this from you anymore." He fell silent, his face tense, but he nodded, letting me know he was ready to listen. I kissed Toby," I whispered, feeling every word burn in my throat. It wasn't planned, and I realized immediately that I had made a mistake. For a moment, there was a deathly silence in the room. Mark stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. He suddenly stood up, and I felt the table tremble slightly from his movement. What?" he almost shouted, his voice breaking. "How could you? Laura, why?" I could see his face flush, his hands trembling. He was furious, but I also saw deep pain in his eyes. "I don't know, Mark," I replied, feeling tears streaming down my cheeks. I got confused. I needed to understand something in myself. "I'm not justifying it, I just want you to know." Mark began pacing around the room, his breathing heavy. For several minutes he couldn't speak, as if he were trying to process what he had just heard. Then, stopping in front of me, he took a deep breath and, struggling to keep his anger in check, said, "Explain it to me, Laura. Explain what this means. Do you still love me? Do you want to be with me or with him? I want to understand what's going on in your head." His words hit me straight in the heart. I realized I couldn't run from the truth anymore. I had to be honest, even if it meant risking everything. After my confession, the silence in the room became unbearable. I watched as Mark tried to process what he had just heard. His face was closed off, his gaze distant, as if he had withdrawn into himself, lost in thoughts I couldn't read. "I'm confused, Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to explain it. I love you, truly. But when Toby came into the picture, I felt something different, something I haven't felt in a long time. I don't know what it means. I don't know what to do." Mark stood still, and I could sense his anger and pain being replaced by something more complex. He took a deep breath, covering his eyes with his hand, as if trying to calm the storm inside him. "I don't know either, Laura," he finally said. "But right now we both need time to figure things out, to understand what we really want." His words were quiet, but there was determination in them. I nodded, realizing he was right. Inside me there was chaos, and I didn't know how to piece my feelings back together. I needed time to figure out what to do next. Mark suggested we take some time apart, to give ourselves space to think. He planned to leave for a few days to stay with friends out of town, to be alone and reflect. I knew he hoped that this time would help us both find answers. Meanwhile, Toby found out about my confession. He came to me that same evening, his face tense, his eyes full of resolve. "Laura, I know you told Mark," he began, "but I can't just walk away. We need to talk, to understand what's really between us." I felt everything inside me tighten again. His words made me reconsider what I truly wanted. But I knew I couldn't go on like this anymore. I had to make a choice, and that choice was for my marriage. "Toby, I can't," I said, trying to stay firm. "I have to try to save my marriage. Please leave. It's not easy for me, but it's the right thing to do." For a moment, Toby looked at me, and I saw pain flash in his eyes. Then he nodded, as if accepting that he couldn't change the situation. "Okay, Laura," he said quietly. "I'll go. I hoped things could be different. But I respect your decision." He turned and left, leaving me standing in the doorway with a heavy heart and thoughts pulling me in different directions. I knew it was the right thing, but the sense of loss was unbearable. As the door closed behind Toby, I felt a growing emptiness inside me. Now, alone with myself, I was faced with a choice that would define the rest of my life. I stood deep in thought, feeling waves of emotion wash over me. Love, pain, regret, fear. I didn't know how to find the right path, but I knew this moment would change everything. In the days that followed, our lives became a series of difficult and awkward conversations. I felt that my relationship with Mark was teetering on the edge, and we were both afraid that any wrong move could destroy what was left of our marriage. But instead of retreating into my emotions as I always had before, I decided we needed to find a way to understand each other. We began attending therapy. At first it felt strange and even frightening to sit in a room with a stranger and talk about our most private thoughts and feelings. Mark was wary, as was I, but we knew we had no other choice if we wanted to try to save our marriage. The therapist turned out to be a gentle and attentive woman who immediately created an atmosphere of trust. She began with simple questions, asking us to talk about our feelings and what was troubling us. At first, our conversations were guarded and cautious, but gradually we started to open up. I realized I needed to be honest not just with Mark, but with myself as well. I admitted that my infatuation with Toby had been a form of escape. It was easier than facing the real problems in our marriage. I had been dissatisfied. I felt something important had disappeared from our relationship. But instead of talking to Mark about it, I found solace in someone else. Mark listened carefully, and although I could see the pain in his eyes, he tried not to blame me. He began to talk about his feelings, too. He admitted that he sometimes felt I was distancing myself from him, but he was afraid to ask questions, afraid of what he might learn. He understood that he was also partly responsible for the gap that had grown between us. Therapy gradually helped us understand each other. It wasn't easy, talking about our fears and pain, revealing our most vulnerable parts. But with each session, I felt the tension between us easing. We began to find the words that had been missing before, and it gave us hope. One day, after another session, when we returned home, Mark came over to me, his face calm but determined. "Laura, I know that a lot has changed between us," he began, looking me straight in the eyes. "But I don't want to lose all this. I love you and I want to fight for us. Let's start over. Let's try again without secrets and resentment." His words touched me deeply. I saw sincerity in his eyes and a desire to make things better. I realized I wanted this too. I was tired of the internal struggle, of the constant guilt and regret. I wanted to find a way to restore what we had lost and maybe build something new, stronger, and more honest. I took his hand and nodded. "Let's try, Mark," I said quietly. "I want to start over too, without fear or lies." And at that moment, I felt a heavy burden lift off my shoulders. There was a lot of work ahead, many difficult conversations, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of relief. It was a chance to start over, and I was ready to take it. After Mark and I decided to start over, I felt a new purpose in my hands. I wanted to fully dedicate myself to our marriage, to restore the trust and intimacy that had been lost. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that it would be a long and challenging road, but I was willing to do everything to bring us back to what we had, and perhaps even more. Mark and I started spending more time together. In the mornings, we would cook breakfast together, discussing plans for the day. We began taking evening walks, like we did in the early days of our relationship. We spoke more often about our thoughts and feelings, unafraid to be open and honest with each other. Slowly, we began to return to our shared interests. We started playing tennis on weekends again, attending concerts and museums that we had always loved. I could see that Mark was also striving to do his best. He became more attentive, listened more, asked questions, and took an interest in what concerned me. There was a tenderness in him that I remembered, but which seemed to have disappeared over time. I felt our emotional connection growing stronger as we learned to trust each other again. But despite all this, a shadow of guilt still lingered within me. I couldn't forget the kiss with Toby, my doubts and mistakes. This feeling haunted me like a shadow, and sometimes I caught myself fearing I might never fully forgive myself. One day, as I was going through my work notes and rereading patient journals, I suddenly realized that my job no longer brought me the satisfaction it once did. I needed to change something, to find new meaning, to stop feeling stuck in the past. And then I decided to change careers. I began helping women who were going through marital crises. I realized that my experience could be valuable to others, that I could support those at a crossroads who, like me, felt lost and didn't know how to move forward. This decision became a form of therapy for me. By helping others, I began to heal myself. I started conducting workshops, organizing support groups, and providing individual counseling. I saw how the women I worked with found their own strength and took difficult but important steps toward their happiness, and this gave me a sense of fulfillment and purpose that I had been missing. Over time, I felt my inner pain begin to recede. I learned to forgive myself for my mistakes and accept my feelings as they were. My marriage with Mark grew stronger because we both learned to be honest with ourselves and each other. We understood that our union required constant attention and care, that it was work to be done every day. I felt that gradually we were returning to the people we were in the beginning, but now we were wiser and stronger, and this gave me hope that there was still much happiness and joy ahead for us. A few months had passed since Toby left. I knew it was the best decision for all of us, but deep down, I couldn't entirely rid myself of the memories of him. Sometimes I found myself thinking about his smile, his voice, the quiet moments we shared, but I tried to let go, to allow those memories to fade into the past. One morning, returning home after a session with a client, I found an envelope in the mailbox with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, and my heart skipped a beat. It was a letter from Toby. I went inside and, feeling a slight flutter of nervousness, opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written on thin white paper. I began to read, and each word seemed to take me back to the moments we had spent together. Dear Laura, I hope this letter finds you well. I've thought long and hard about whether I should write to you, but in the end, I decided it was the right thing to do. I want to thank you for everything you did for me. You gave me hope when I felt lost and showed me that I could still feel. I have decided to start a new life in another city. Here I have a chance for something new, an opportunity to become someone else, to free myself from the past. I sincerely wish you happiness, Laura. I hope you find peace and fulfillment in your marriage, and that you can leave all our memories behind. You deserve love and happiness, and I believe you will find them. Goodbye, Toby. I felt a deep stillness inside. Toby's words were a farewell, but there was no bitterness or resentment in them, only quiet gratitude and acceptance. I realized that this was truly the end of that chapter in my life where I had allowed myself to be carried away, lost, and confused in my emotions. I sat with the letter in my hands for a long time, rereading it over and over. Then I stood up, went to the backyard, and took out a box of matches. I held the letter to the flame and watched as the paper began to curl and darken until it turned to fine ash. This was my way of saying goodbye. Goodbye to the mistakes, the doubts, the pain that had lived inside me all this time. I knew there was still much work to do on myself, on my relationship with Mark, but at that moment, I felt the heavy burden I had been carrying finally begin to lift. I went back into the house feeling light and free, as if something important had been completed, and I knew I was now ready to move forward. After everything that had happened, Mark and I felt we needed something special to mark the new phase in our lives. We talked a lot about how we wanted to celebrate our new beginning, and one evening, while we were sitting in the kitchen with cups of tea, Mark suggested, "Let's have a second honeymoon." I looked at him and felt a warm feeling growing in my chest. The idea seemed perfect, a symbolic gesture that could mean we were truly starting over. We decided to go to a place we had never been before, so everything around us would feel fresh and new, just like our future. We chose a small seaside town in Italy. There was nothing luxurious or ostentatious about it, just a quiet place with narrow streets, cozy cafes, and the endless horizon of the blue sea. We stayed in a small villa surrounded by olive groves and vineyards. Every day during this trip, we discovered something new. Morning walks along the beach, local wine tastings, spontaneous trips to nearby villages. We laughed, talked, held hands like in the early days of our life together. We allowed ourselves to be sincere and vulnerable, sharing our dreams and fears as if we were starting over. This journey was not just a vacation for us. It was an opportunity to connect on a deep level, to see each other anew, without the shadow of the past. The time we spent together made us feel closer to each other than ever before. One evening, as we sat on the terrace of our villa watching the sunset, Mark looked at me and took my hand. "Laura," he began quietly, "I feel like our love has grown deeper." And I thought, maybe it's time to think about expanding our family? I smiled. There was no pressure in his words, just a gentle suggestion. I knew what he meant, and I realized that I was ready for this step too. "I think you're right," I replied, feeling my heart fill with joy. "I want that too." We returned from the trip feeling that our marriage was stronger than ever. We were ready to move forward, to start thinking about the future and the possibility of having a family. I felt that my love for Mark had become deeper and stronger, that we had gone through tough times and emerged from them renewed. Our second honeymoon became the beginning of something new and beautiful. It gave us the opportunity to look at our marriage with a new perspective, to rediscover each other, and to realize that there was much happiness and many new opportunities ahead. And I knew that now, we were ready to face that future together. After returning from our second honeymoon, Mark and I felt ready for the next step. Our conversations about the future became more serious. We often talked about how we wanted to build our life moving forward. One evening, as we sat on the couch with glasses of wine, Mark unexpectedly brought up something that had been on both our minds. "Laura," he said, carefully looking into my eyes, "I know we've talked about expanding our family, and I want to discuss an idea. What do you think about adoption?" His suggestion caught me by surprise, but at the same time, it sparked a wave of warmth inside me. Adoption was something I had thought about before but never dared to propose. I always felt that there was room in our home for another person, that our love could be shared further. I smiled, feeling my heart fill with joy. "I think it's a wonderful idea, Mark. I really do. I believe we can give a child so much love and care." We began to discuss the details, how to start the adoption process, the steps we needed to take, and how long it might take. Mark was full of enthusiasm, and I saw a light in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. Our plans began to take shape, and we both eagerly anticipated the start of this new chapter. We started gathering information, meeting with agencies, and consulting with families who had already gone through the process. Each meeting, each step forward brought us new understanding and further strengthened our desire. We realized that adoption wasn't just a way to create a family, it was an opportunity to give a child a chance at a better future. As we delved deeper into this process, I felt our marriage take on a new dimension and meaning. We were not just partners or spouses. We were a team ready for a new challenge. We felt that this journey would lead us to something truly important and meaningful. With each passing day, I became more convinced that I had made the right choice by leaving the past behind and focusing my energy on creating a new, happy future. I understood that the child, whoever we would welcome into our family, would not only be a gift to us but also a symbol of how we had managed to overcome all difficulties and start anew. Mark and I filled out the first documents, signed the applications, and began preparing to become parents. The process was long and sometimes exhausting, but we knew that every step brought us closer to our goal. We eagerly awaited the moment when we could meet our future child, when we could offer them a home full of love and care. I felt my heart swell with gratitude for this new stage in our lives. We were ready to move forward, to face all the challenges and joys that awaited us on this journey together. I knew we were now stronger than ever and ready to build something truly beautiful. Now that we had started this process, I understood that our past would remain in the past. We had made the right choice, and now we were ready to look only ahead, to the bright and joyful future we would create together.